The sun hung low over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the bustling city. Inside a small, almost forgotten diner on the edge of a quiet street, the atmosphere was peaceful, too peaceful for the kind of day Keanu Reeves was about to have. The clink of silverware against plates, the soft hum of conversation, and the sizzling sound of bacon on the grill painted a picture of calm. But for Keanu, who had just finished a long day on set, this moment of serenity felt like a breath of fresh air, a rare escape from the constant glare of the public eye. He sat alone at a corner booth, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, his face partially obscured by dark sunglasses. The hustle of the city outside seemed distant, muffled by the walls of the diner. He hadn't expected much from this quick stop for breakfast. Just a quiet place to relax, a brief refuge before heading back into the chaos of his life. But something about this morning felt off, even as he settled into his seat. The air had an electric tension to it, like the calm before a storm. Keanu's eyes wandered across the room, barely noticing the few scattered customers, until his gaze fell on the little girl. She was sitting alone at a table across the room, clutching a broken toy car in her small hands. Her clothes were worn, her hair tangled in messy braids, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet desperation that stood in stark contrast to the joyfulness of the other children around. She kept glancing up at him, her gaze intense, almost as if she was working up the courage to speak, but every time their eyes met, she quickly looked away. Keanu felt a shift in the air, something he couldn't quite place. The diner felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls were closing in. He took another sip of his coffee, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He turned his attention back to the girl, watching as she stood up, her movements hesitant but determined. She glanced over her shoulder at a man sitting at a nearby table, his back straight, his suit impeccably tailored, his phone glued to his ear. There was a coldness in his posture, a sense of control that seemed to radiate from him. She hesitated for a moment, but then, clutching the toy car even tighter, she began to walk toward Keanu. The moment she reached his table, she stopped, her small frame trembling ever so slightly. Keanu noticed the way she was holding the toy, as though it was the only thing in the world keeping her grounded. For a moment, their eyes locked, his calm, hers wide with something between fear and hope. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "I need your help," she said, her voice cracking. Keanu leaned in, instinctively feeling the weight of her words before they fully registered. But what she said next, what she whispered in his ear, made the world around him seem to freeze. "He's going to hurt my mom," she whispered. "He said no one would believe me, but I swear it's true, can you help us?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, his body instinctively wanting to protect the child, but the man, the one who had been watching them, was already standing, his cold eyes narrowing as he fixed his gaze on Keanu. Without missing a beat, Keanu stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice steady, though there was a flicker of tension in his gaze. The man didn't respond immediately, but Keanu could see the anger building behind his eyes. For a moment, everything in the diner seemed to slow down, the clatter of dishes, the hum of the coffee machine, the murmurs of patrons all faded into a distant blur. All that mattered was the girl in front of him and the man who was about to cross a line. The man finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Stay out of it," he warned, his tone ice cold. Keanu didn't flinch. He turned his attention back to the girl, who was now looking up at him with wide, pleading eyes. In that moment, he knew there was no turning back. This wasn't just a child asking for help, it was a life, a family in danger, and he couldn't walk away. He stepped closer to the man, his voice calm but firm. "I think it's time you leave her alone." And just like that, the storm that had been quietly brewing in the corners of the diner was about to break. The man took a step closer, his eyes narrowing, studying Keanu with a mix of disdain and amusement. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is none of your business." Keanu stood his ground, his posture calm but unyielding. His gaze flickered briefly to the little girl, her small form trembling in front of him, clutching that broken toy car as if it were the only thing tethering her to the world. Her fear was palpable, almost suffocating. Keanu's heart clenched, but he kept his face unreadable, focused on the man in front of him. The man's gaze shifted between Keanu and the girl, a sneer spreading across his face. "She's just a kid, right? What do you care? Let her go back to playing with her dolls and stop pretending to be some hero." His voice was thick with sarcasm, the words intended to provoke. Keanu didn't flinch. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "I'm not pretending to be anything. I'm just trying to help." The man chuckled bitterly, stepping even closer now, his breath a hot wave of anger. "Help? You're gonna help a little brat like her?" He jerked his thumb toward the girl, but Keanu never took his eyes off him. A tense silence hung in the air. The tension was thick, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, the kind of silence that always comes before violence. And in that moment, Keanu knew something was off. This wasn't just a man with a temper, this was someone dangerous, someone who had nothing left to lose. He had to be careful. Keanu's mind raced, weighing his options. He wasn't afraid. But he knew one wrong move could set everything off. He glanced over his shoulder toward the counter, where Rachel, the waitress, was discreetly watching the scene unfold. Her eyes were wide with concern, and she slowly reached down under the counter. Keanu caught her eye, giving her a barely perceptible nod. The man stepped back, rolling his neck with a grimace. "You really want to do this? You think you can take me down? You're just some actor. Not even a real man." The words were venomous, meant to provoke, to make Keanu question himself. Keanu didn't blink. "I don't need to be a real man to stand up to you. I just need to do what's right." The man took another step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. But Keanu was ready. He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension that hung between them, thick as smoke. The girl was still standing there, clutching her toy, but her eyes were fixed on Keanu. Her fear had melted into something else, something like hope, or maybe desperation. Keanu didn't back down. His eyes locked with the man's, unwavering. "You don't scare me. Whatever you think you're going to do, it ends here. Leave her alone." The man's lip curled in a mocking grin. "You don't know the first thing about me. I can do whatever I want. This is my world." He glanced once more at the girl, and Keanu could see the malicious intent in his eyes. Keanu's voice dropped, its calm tone betraying the anger he was holding back. "No, it's not. This is her world. And right now, you're just a problem in it. So step away." For a brief second, the man hesitated. Just long enough for Keanu to see a flicker of doubt cross his eyes. But it didn't last. With a roar of frustration, the man lunged forward, his hand shooting out toward Keanu. Everything happened in a flash. Keanu sidestepped, his instincts sharp, years of training and street-smart survival kicking in. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it with a fluid motion, forcing him to stumble forward, crashing into the side of the table. The diner fell silent, save for the muffled sound of the man's grunt of pain. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Keanu stood over the man, his body tense, ready for anything. The man struggled to regain his balance, his face red with fury. "Back off," Keanu said, his voice quiet but full of authority. The man growled, his face twisted in rage, but he slowly backed away, his hands raised in mock surrender. "This isn't over," he spat. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning." Keanu didn't respond. He didn't need to. His eyes never left the man as he turned on his heel and stormed out of the diner. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing in the now still room. The moment he was gone, Keanu turned to the girl. Emma. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and fear, her body still shaking slightly. But there was something else there now, a hint of relief. She wasn't alone anymore. Keanu knelt down to her level, his voice gentle. Are you okay? She nodded slowly, her grip on her broken toy car still tight, but there was a small, almost imperceptible smile on her lips. You're the first person who's ever listened, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Keanu smiled softly, reaching out to touch her shoulder reassuringly. You did the right thing by speaking up. You're stronger than you think. As he stood up, his eyes met Rachel's across the room. She gave him a small, grateful nod, her hands still trembling slightly from the tension. Keanu knew that this wasn't over, but for now, Emma was safe. And that was enough. But something told him that whatever was coming next would be far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. Keanu stood there, his eyes never leaving the door through which the man had just exited. His pulse was still racing, and though the immediate danger seemed to have passed, the air in the diner remained thick with unease. He turned back to Emma, who was still standing by his side, clutching the toy car as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. The relief in her eyes was tempered by an underlying fear, one that Keanu knew would linger for a long time. Before Keanu could say anything, the door to the diner opened again, and in stepped the man. Terry. This time, his eyes were wild, his fists clenched. He wasn't leaving without a fight, and Keanu could see the fury boiling just beneath the surface. You think you've won, huh? Terry spat, his voice low, like a growl ready to explode. You think you can just walk in and play hero? Well, you've got another thing coming. His face was flushed, his teeth grinding in a display of barely contained rage. Keanu's gaze was calm, controlled, but there was a sharpness there that wasn't to be underestimated. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the kind of pressure that builds before a storm, the moment before everything cracks wide open. He took a step forward, positioning himself between Emma and Terry, his presence a shield, though his mind was already calculating the next move. Terry's hands were trembling now, either with fury or something else, Keanu couldn't tell. But there was something desperate in his eyes, something dangerous. This wasn't just a man with a bruised ego, this was someone who would do whatever it took to hold on to control, to whatever twisted grip he thought he had over Emma. Get out of my way, Terry barked, his voice a jagged edge, his hand moving toward Keanu. His fingers were curled into fists, his body leaning forward like a predator preparing to strike. Keanu didn't flinch. His voice was quiet, but it carried an undeniable weight. You're not touching her. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that makes every breath feel like a drumbeat in the chest. Then, in a blur of movement, Terry lunged forward. Keanu reacted instinctively. As Terry's arm swung toward him, Keanu sidestepped with precise, practiced ease. He caught Terry's wrist with a swift, firm grip, twisting it so that the man's balance faltered. With a grunt, Terry stumbled, crashing into a nearby table, his back slamming into the edge with a painful crack. The diner's patrons froze, their eyes wide with shock, not sure whether they should intervene or just stay out of the way. The situation was escalating too fast, and no one knew what would happen next. But Keanu's focus remained on Terry, who was now struggling to regain his footing. You don't scare me, Terry sneered, his voice strained with pain and anger. He pushed himself up from the floor, his eyes burning with hatred. You think you can just waltz in here, be the good guy, and everything's gonna be fine. You don't know who you're messing with. Keanu didn't respond. He was done with words. His eyes were hard now, his stance steady, ready for whatever Terry was going to do next. The man charged again, but this time, Keanu anticipated the move. As Terry came at him, Keanu ducked low and swung his leg in a smooth, fluid motion. He caught Terry's ankle, sending him crashing down to the floor with a loud thud. The man let out a strangled cry of frustration as he scrambled to get back up, but Keanu was already on him, pinning him to the ground with one swift, calculated movement. Terry struggled beneath him, his body thrashing in a futile attempt to break free, but Keanu held him down with the pressure of his arm across the man's chest. "You're done," Keanu said softly, his voice laced with authority, though his eyes were still focused on Terry. "The game's over." A tense silence hung between them. The man's chest heaved with each ragged breath, his fury a silent, seething thing. Keanu could feel it, could almost taste the anger in the air. It wasn't over, not yet. Terry wasn't going to just walk away, he was broken, both in body and spirit, but the violence that had led him here wasn't going to dissipate so easily. Keanu knew that the moment he let his guard down, it would all start again. And then, the sound of sirens, distant at first, but growing louder, cut through the silence. Terry's eyes flicked toward the door, his body still trembling beneath Keanu's hold. "You think the police are going to save you?" Terry hissed, his voice venomous, laced with disbelief. "You think they'll protect you from me?" Keanu held his gaze steady, unshaken. "They'll protect her. And that's all that matters." The door swung open again, this time with more authority. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence filling the room like a weight lifted. They assessed the scene with trained precision, Keanu on top of Terry, the man writhing beneath him, his anger slowly fading as reality set in. One officer, a tall man with dark eyes, spoke first. "Everything okay here, sir?" His voice was calm, but Keanu could hear the underlying tension. Keanu nodded, not taking his eyes off Terry. "Yeah. Just making sure she's safe." The officer motioned for his partner to approach, and together, they moved in to help. One of them handcuffed Terry's wrists while the other took a moment to speak with Keanu, though their attention was divided between him and the still shaking figure of Emma, who had moved to the side, now quietly watching the unfolding events. "Thank you," the officer said quietly, after a long pause. "We've been keeping an eye on him. He's not as clean as he looks." Keanu glanced back at Emma, who was now slowly exhaling, her grip on her toy car loosening, a small sign of relief in her tense body. The storm had passed, but Keanu could still see the traces of fear in her eyes. The man who had terrified her was now handcuffed and being led out of the diner, but the scars of what had happened would stay with her for much longer. Keanu stood up, stepping away from the scene as the officers took control. Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude and confusion. "Are you really?" she started, her voice trembling. Keanu gave her a soft smile, a reassuring nod. "Yeah. It's over. You're safe now." Emma's eyes shone with something deeper than fear now. Something like hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Keanu offered her a smile, one that reached his eyes. "Just take care of yourself, all right?" As the officers led Terry out of the diner, Keanu turned to leave. The weight of the situation was far from over, but he knew that he had done what needed to be done. The world would go on, just as it always did. But for Emma, for now, at least, she was safe. And that was enough. Keanu stepped out of the diner into the bright sunlight, his eyes squinting slightly against the glare. The air felt cool, a stark contrast to the simmering tension that had just erupted inside. He could still feel the weight of the moment pressing on his chest, the sense that something wasn't quite finished. But for now, Emma was safe. The officers had taken Terry, and the storm had passed. Or so Keanu hoped. As he made his way to his car, Keanu's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the message. "Keanu, we've got something on Terry. You need to stay where you are. This is bigger than we thought." The text came from an old friend in law enforcement, someone Keanu had known for years. He'd never been one to shy away from danger, but something about this felt different. He could feel it deep in his gut. He stopped in his tracks, his thumb hovering over the screen. He had a decision to make. Part of him wanted to leave, wanted to move on, to let the authorities handle whatever was coming. But another part of him knew he couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not after everything that had just happened. Keanu hit the reply button, typing quickly. "Where are you?" He didn't wait for a response. His instincts told him there was something else at play here, something Terry wasn't telling them. The man hadn't just been angry, he'd been desperate. And desperate people, Keanu knew, were the most dangerous. He turned back toward the diner, his mind racing. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his concentration, and he spun around, his hand instinctively going to his side. But it wasn't Terry. It was Rachel, the waitress from inside. Her face was drawn, worried, but there was a determination in her eyes. "Keanu," she said, her voice low but urgent. "I overheard something. Terry, he's not just some guy. He's connected. And not in a good way." Keanu's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Rachel glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "I overheard him on the phone before all this went down. He was talking about someone who's involved in some really bad stuff. Drugs. Human trafficking. He was scared, Keanu. And whatever he's involved in, it's bad. Really bad." Keanu felt a chill run down his spine. The weight of the situation suddenly shifted, like a turn in the road that he hadn't seen coming. He'd thought this was just some random act of violence, but now he realized it was far more complicated. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. Rachel nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm sure. And I think Terry was trying to get Emma involved somehow." Keanu's jaw tightened. He didn't know what the hell was going on, but he did know one thing for sure, he wasn't going to let anything happen to that little girl. Not now. Not ever. He looked at Rachel, his expression hardening. "Where is she?" Rachel swallowed, glancing back toward the diner. "She left. Her mom came to pick her up, but Keanu, I don't think she's safe. Not with what Terry was talking about. You have to do something." Without another word, Keanu turned and sprinted back to his car. His mind was racing, the pieces falling into place faster than he could make sense of them. Terry's involvement in something larger than he'd initially thought, and Emma was the key. She was somehow caught in the middle of it all. Keanu floored the gas pedal, his car tearing down the street, his thoughts consumed by the weight of what Rachel had told him. He didn't know exactly what Terry's connection was, or why Emma was so important to him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than he could handle alone. His phone buzzed again, the same number flashing on the screen. Keanu didn't hesitate. "Keanu," his friend said, his voice urgent. "We found something. Terry's linked to a larger operation. We're tracking him now. You need to get to Emma's house. It's not safe for her anymore. Not with him out there." Keanu's stomach dropped. He didn't need to ask for details. He knew what it meant. "I'm on my way." The drive to Emma's house felt like an eternity. Keanu's mind was filled with images of the girl, her innocent face twisted with fear, clutching that broken toy car as if it were the only thing she had left in the world. He couldn't let her become another victim. Not on his watch. As he pulled up to the small, quiet neighborhood, Keanu's eyes immediately scanned the area. The house was quiet, too quiet. There was no sign of movement, but something told him that it was all wrong. The door was slightly ajar, the kind of detail that could easily be overlooked, but not by someone like Keanu. He parked his car quickly, his heart pounding as he approached the house. The air was thick with tension, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up as he approached the front door. He reached for the handle, pushing it open slowly. The house was dark, the faint smell of something off lingering in the air. Keanu stepped inside, his footsteps silent as he moved through the hallway. The silence was deafening, and his breath came in shallow, controlled bursts. He was on edge, knowing something was wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Then he heard it, faint, but unmistakable. The sound of a cry, muffled, coming from the living room. Keanu's heart skipped a beat as he rushed forward, his eyes scanning the darkened room. There, lying on the floor, was Sarah, Emma's mother. She was unconscious, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead, her body slumped against the couch as if she had been knocked to the ground. Keanu's pulse surged. He was too late. He knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. Weak, but steady. Relief flooded him, but it was brief. This wasn't over. Emma was still out there, and whoever had done this was still a threat. His phone buzzed again, and he answered quickly. "Keanu, where are you?" his friend asked, his voice clipped. "I'm at Emma's house," Keanu said, his voice urgent. "Her mom's hurt, but she's alive. I need backup. Stay put. We're on our way. Just stay with her." Keanu's eyes flicked around the room, taking in the chaos. Something wasn't right. The room was torn apart, the furniture overturned as if there had been a struggle. And then he saw it, an open drawer, papers scattered across the floor. The papers looked familiar, names, dates, and one thing that stood out, Emma's name. Keanu grabbed a few sheets and scanned them quickly. His blood ran cold. These weren't just random papers. These were records, part of the operation Terry had been involved in. And Emma's name was right in the middle of it. Keanu's fists clenched, a fire igniting in his chest. Terry wasn't the only one who was dangerous. Whoever was behind all of this had just made a grave mistake. He wasn't going to let them get away with it. The sirens grew louder, and Keanu stood up, grabbing Sarah's phone. He needed to get her help, but more importantly, he needed to find Emma before it was too late. The sound of the sirens outside grew louder as Keanu moved quickly through the house, his mind racing. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He couldn't waste any time. Every second mattered. He grabbed the phone from Sarah's hand and quickly dialed 911, his voice steady but urgent as he relayed the situation. "Emergency services," the operator's voice crackled in his ear. "What's the nature of your emergency?" "It's a woman, unconscious, possibly assaulted. There's a child, she's in danger too. I need immediate assistance at Emma's address. Hurry." Keanu didn't wait for a response, he hung up the phone and sprinted out of the house, his eyes scanning the street, searching for any sign of movement, any sign of Emma. He stood still for a moment, listening. The quiet was suffocating. The weight of what he had seen inside the house pressed on him. He couldn't shake the image of Sarah lying unconscious, the papers scattered across the floor with Emma's name on them, evidence of something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. Terry wasn't just a random thug, he was part of a much larger operation, one that had far-reaching consequences, and Emma was at the center of it all. Keanu's phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was his friend in law enforcement. "Keanu, we've got some updates. We traced Terry's movements. He's been involved in human trafficking and other illegal activities. We're closing in on his contacts." "Where are you now?" "I'm at the house. Sarah's hurt, but she's alive. I need to find Emma. I think she's the next target. I don't know what they want with her, but whatever it is, it's dangerous. We're sending backup. Hold tight. Do not leave the scene until we arrive. We'll be there in a few." Keanu didn't need telling twice. He hung up and ran back toward his car, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. He knew Emma could be anywhere. Terry had been desperate enough to get to her, and with his connections, there was no telling where she might be taken next. The streets blurred past him as Keanu drove faster, weaving through traffic, his eyes scanning every corner, every alley. He felt the familiar sense of urgency in his chest, a feeling that had accompanied him on countless occasions in his life. But this time was different. This time it wasn't just some movie script, it was real, and real lives were at stake. As he neared the edge of town, Keanu spotted a white van parked in a secluded area, the engine running. His heart skipped a beat. He pulled his car over to the side of the road, watching from a distance. There were two men standing next to the van, looking around nervously. Keanu didn't need to hear their conversation to know they were part of Terry's network. And if Emma was anywhere near here, she was in grave danger. He dialed his friend's number again, his fingers trembling slightly as he spoke. "I think I've found them. I'm at location. They're in a van. There's a chance Emma's inside. Keanu, don't engage unless you have backup. We're 5 minutes away, just hold your position." Keanu didn't respond. He wasn't going to wait for backup, not when a child's life was hanging in the balance. He was done waiting. He opened his car door slowly, keeping his movements calculated and silent, before slipping into the shadows. His instincts were sharp, honed from years of experience, and he moved like a ghost through the streets, getting closer to the van. The men were still talking, unaware of Keanu's presence. He could hear their voices now, low, urgent. One of them was saying something about a new shipment, something about taking the girl to a location off the grid. That was all Keanu needed to hear. He knew they weren't just moving Emma, they were getting ready to disappear with her. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no turning back now. He wasn't going to let them take Emma. Not without a fight. He crept closer to the van, careful not to make a sound. He could see the faint silhouette of a figure inside, but it was hard to make out details through the tinted windows. His heart raced, but his focus was unwavering. He had to move fast. Just as he was about to approach the driver's side, the door to the van swung open. Keanu froze. The man from the diner, the one who had been with Terry, stepped out, his hand reaching for something in his jacket. Keanu's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he launched himself forward, using his body to knock the man to the ground, the impact muffled by the dirt beneath them. The other man scrambled, pulling a weapon from his waistband, but Keanu was already on him, disarming him with one fluid motion. He spun the man around, slamming him into the side of the van, pinning him down with a firm grip. The sound of the struggle alerted the first man, who was now trying to get up, but Keanu was faster. He moved with precision, his knee pressing into the man's chest as he forced him to the ground. "Where is she?" Keanu demanded, his voice cold and sharp. "Where's Emma?" The man's eyes widened in fear, but he didn't answer. Keanu leaned closer, his face inches from the man's. "You'll tell me, or I'll make you wish you had." The man swallowed hard, his body tense beneath Keanu's grip. She's in the back. Don't hurt me. Please." Keanu didn't hesitate. He stood up, leaving the man on the ground, and rushed to the back of the van. The doors creaked open, and there, huddled in the corner, was Emma. Her wide eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, everything else faded. She was safe. She was alive. "Emma," Keanu said, his voice gentle but urgent. "It's okay. You're safe now." The girl didn't move at first, still too scared to trust him fully. But when Keanu held out his hand, her hesitation melted away. She slowly stood up, taking his hand with a firm grip. He guided her out of the van, his eyes scanning the area for any other threats. Just as they reached the edge of the alley, the sound of sirens filled the air, the backup Keanu had been waiting for finally arriving. The police cruisers screeched to a halt, and officers flooded the area, securing the men in the van and taking them into custody. Keanu watched as Emma was led to safety, a sense of relief washing over him. The nightmare was over. Emma was safe. But the battle wasn't finished. Terry and his operation would pay for what they had done. Keanu wouldn't stop until every last one of them was brought to justice. As he watched the officers work, Keanu felt the weight of the day finally lifting off his shoulders. He'd done what he had set out to do. Emma was safe, and that's all that mattered. With one final glance at the van, Keanu turned and walked away, knowing that the fight for justice wasn't over, but today, at least, they had won.